Okay, so let's talk about how the rhetorical situation, the configuration of audience purpose and context, affects and informs your organization of your information, the way that you actually write your communication, and the way that you go through and revise your communication. Let's start out with the organization of it. I'm sorry, I'm going to first remind you what audience and context and purpose is. This is the rhetorical situation. These are the three elements of it. I've constantly emphasized this. It's incredibly important for you to be able to adjust your writing based on these three factors. And you see how these three factors have two-ended arrows going to them? That means that the audience is related to the context, and the context is related to the purpose, and the purpose is related to the audience. They're pretty much inseparable of one another. But your best approach before you actually write your communication is to analyze the situation based on who you're writing it to, the situation into which you're writing it, and what you're trying to accomplish with it. So let's go into the organization now. So how does the way that you analyze your audience affect the way you're going to organize your information? So when I say organization, what I'm largely talking about is actually doing the outline before you actually start writing or drafting the information. And your consideration of audience is going to come really early on. It's definitely coming in the pre-writing stage. So you're going to determine what your audience knows of the topic, what the previous knowledge of the topic has been. Because if the audience has a tremendous amount of knowledge about the topic, you don't have to go as deep into it, and you therefore won't have to set up an organizational pattern that explains, such as the division and classification pattern, which you can see on page 48. What that does is it breaks down subtopics. It breaks information down into subtopics. If your audience has previous knowledge of your topic, you often won't have to divide the topics down because they'll understand that already. So that's one way that's one organizational approach that is affected by audience. Let's look at the mindset of your audience. What I mean by this is, what is the state of being that they're in when they receive your information? Are they overwhelmed? Are they busy? Are they stressed out? Are they relaxed? Are they in kind of a learning process where they're trying to figure out how to accomplish a process? Whatever they're in will determine the organizational pattern that you go with. So if they're rushed and they're stressed, for example, you might want to do the specific to general. This is the type of organizational pattern that you often see in journalism because people tend to not read entire newspaper articles. They just read the first couple of paragraphs. And so the starting out specific and moving into general provides the reader with all the information they need in the first couple of paragraphs of your communication, and then should they not read the rest of your stuff, they're not going to be at a loss for what they need to accomplish or do or what the situation is. So that's another example of how the mindset or the point of view the audience is in is going to affect a particular organizational pattern. Their reading patterns and their habits. This is closely tied to the type of reading that they've done in the past, the genres that they often read. So for example, if you're working in a journalism setting, one of the genres that you're going to see is going to be press releases. So a press release is pretty much written by a company or written by somebody who works for a company to try to get the company coverage in the newspaper. And that's going to have a particular organizational pattern to it. It's often going to have the decreasing order of importance pattern on page 51, which again is you tell them the most important information they need in the first couple of sentences, and then it gets less and less important. And that's designed for someone who's in the reading pattern or habit of skimming, for example. Okay, other things that are designed based on skimming would be things like spatial organizational pattern, where you're simply describing an object by the way that it's set up. Here's the front of it, here's the back of it, here's where something is located. You can also be thinking about this in terms of giving somebody directions. That's going to be spatial organization, where you're describing a place or you're describing an object. And again, if your reader is someone who's like an engineer, for example, they're very used to the spatial organization pattern because they work with objects. Okay, so also you need to be thinking about, what do you want them to do after they're done reading your communication? Do you want them to be convinced of something? Do you want them to take some kind of action? Do you want them simply to be informed? Now, depending upon what you want them to do, you may choose different organizational patterns. For example, if you want them to complete a process, like you're giving them instructions for, let's say, putting in a garbage disposal in their sink, well, then you're going to want to do a sequential or a chronological organizational pattern. You can read about sequential on page 40, and that just goes through on a step-by-step. The first step that you do is unscrew the previous garbage disposal, for example. The second step you do is such and such. So again, what do you want them to do is going to determine your organizational pattern. And this is focusing on the audience. Now let's look at how the focus on the purpose is going to determine your organizational pattern. This is similar to what I mentioned already, the end result that you seek for them to do. What do you want to have happen as a result of your communication? Do you want somebody to be able to find their way through a building? Do you want somebody to be convinced or persuaded of something? Do you want somebody to be informed? Do you want somebody to make a choice? For example, if my end result, if I'm going to propose let's say I'm going to propose 2 tablets for my boss because my boss wants to use tablets, and he came to me and said, hey, could you research the iPad and the Android tablet? Then I would do a comparison organization because my end result is that this boss would then make a choice. Also need to be thinking about the scope. Now, the scope is essentially what you want to cover and what you need to cover versus what you don't need to cover. One thing you want to be thinking about when you're writing professional communication is what don't I need to say about this topic, because maybe my audience has previous knowledge about it, or maybe it's simply not that important to my audience. So the scope, the specific bit of information you're going to reveal about a topic is going to determine the organizational pattern as well. If you have a very small amount of information you want to reveal about a topic, then you would maybe start out with the specific to general type of organizational pattern, right? If you have a lot of information that you want to share about a topic, you might want to start out general and get specific, and then get to the most important elements of that communication near the end of it. Another element of purpose that's affecting your organization is what you want to emphasize. Readers tend to be most influenced by what appears at the beginning of your communication and what appears at the end of your communication. There's a little trick called the relay method. And if you remember, if any of you were in track as kids, like in high school or in middle school, you remember the relay race. The very first person that you had run in that relay race was the second strongest runner. The second and third people that you had run in the relay race are the 2 worst runners, and the last person that you have run in the relay race is the strongest runner. So let's say you want to do something where you're trying to persuade a boss to give you a promotion. Well, you should come up with some reasons why this promotion should happen. And the strongest reason should be the very last thing that you communicate. It should be at the end of your message. The second strongest reason should be at the beginning of your message. And then the middle stuff is not that strong of reasons. The reason I have you do this is because your reader is going to remember the first topic you tell them and the last topic you tell them more than they're going to remember the middle topic that you tell them. So again, it all depends on, like, if I'm trying to persuade, if I'm trying to inform. In some cases, you may actually want to hide certain bits of information, right? Like if you're running into some liability issues, for example, and a lawyer contacts you and says, could you please give us an account and a report of what happened in this situation? Let's say someone got in a fight and a lawyer wants you to contact them and tell them this. Well, then you may want to hide the stuff that could really ruin your company in the middle of the communication. It's still there. It's just that they may not remember it. Okay, so that's how purpose is going to affect your organization. What you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to emphasize should be at that very beginning. And also you need to be thinking about what that end result is going to be that you're trying to accomplish and how your organizational pattern is going to help that end result be accomplished. So let's look at how context affects your organization. If you remember from week 1, context is the particular place and time in which the communication occurs. It's also the way that the communication occurs. It's also the culture into which the communication occurs and from which the communication occurs. It's all of the relationships that are affiliated with that communication. It's also the story behind why you're communicating in the first place. So that's context. So first off, context carries with it a sense of medium. The medium is the engine that you use to communicate information. Let's say that it's going to be email. Let's say it's going to be a hard copy or a poster, or let's say it's going to be a video, etc. That's the medium. So what you decide to do with your medium is going to affect your organizational pattern. For example, if you're going to do a PowerPoint, let's say, then you may want to do a decreasing order of importance. You may want to have the most important information in the first couple of slides, and then it gets less and less important from there on out. If you're going to do, for example, an email, right, you might want to do the specific to general organizational pattern, where what they need to know is at the very top, and then you get more and more general as you go along. If you're going to be doing some kind of a poster, let's say you're talking about two different products, or you're looking at the products of competitors, then your comparison organizational pattern is going to be the best way to go, because that just puts these two objects side by side, and it provides all the features and benefits about each object. So that's how the medium affects your approach. Let's look at the genre. Now, genre and medium are different. Genre is the style, the expectations the reader has of you, the type of communication that's occurring versus the way the communication is occurring. So some examples of genre would be things like memos, informal reports, formal reports, okay, stuff like that. So now, depending on what your genre is telling you to do, let's say you're doing a memo. Well, one of the best ways to organize a memo would be to have your most important information at the very beginning, because you let the people know what the memo is going to address, and then they read through if they need to. Another good way to organize a memo is going to be your division and classification. Division and classification is an organizational pattern in which you take ideas and you break them down into subtopics. So for example, let's say there's going to be a new client coming to Milwaukee to visit, okay? And my boss asked me to come up with some good entertainment options for that client at night. Well, what I might do then is I might organize those different entertainment options, right? I might have like food and beverage. And then underneath that food and beverage topic, I'd have a bunch of food and beverage options. And then I would maybe have like theater, okay? And that's a bold headline, theater. And then underneath that bold headline, theater, I have all the theater options, etc. So see how it's just classified into its categories? That classification approach is very good for memos, because memos rely on bold headlines that categorize information into their different classes. Another element of context that's going to affect your organization is how is a document actually going to be used once it gets into the location in which it's going to be used. If I'm writing an instruction manual for repairing a bike chain, for example, I need to be thinking about where the person who's repairing the bike chain is sitting, what type of room they're sitting in, what they're doing with their hands at the time, what's going through their mind at the time, and all these factors that are environmental type of factors. Because if that person, for example, has really greasy hands, let's say, because they're changing a chain, then for one thing, it's going to affect my medium. I'm going to want to go with like a poster, and I'm going to want to make it laminated. But for another thing, it's going to affect my organizational pattern, because they're going to want to be able to figure out all the information they need to know without having to use their hands. So like maybe I want all the most important information in that manual in the first couple of pages so they don't have to use their hands very much. So you see how the environmental factor might affect the way a document's organized. You also need to be thinking about the previous chain of communication. Communication never occurs in a vacuum. It's always a product of all the communications related to it that came before. And so that can be a good indication if you want to look at previous, let's say you're doing email back and forth with a boss. Look at how that boss organized the information. Let's say the boss had like 3 questions that he wrote for you. And then he numbered them 1, 2, 3. Well, if you're going to answer those 3 questions in an email, you want to number the answers 1, 2, and 3. Because that responds to the previous chain of communication, and that responds to his organizational pattern that he used in the first place. So that is how your organization is going to be affected by your audience, your purpose, and your context. Let's take a look now at how the drafting itself. What I mean by drafting is the actual writing that's occurring. So the organization was like an outline thing where you put together how your paper is going to look. Drafting is actually writing it. So thinking about your audience is going to affect the tone that you use when you're drafting. The tone is pretty much the attitude that you have toward your subject matter and towards your audience. And it also is indicative of the relationship that you have with your audience, right? You might have a formal relationship with that audience, So you want to have an organizational pattern that's a more formal organizational pattern. And that might be something like sequential or chronological.